The day she called me a bad influence, I was holding the receipt that kept her reputation spotless. That line lives in my bones now. It was September 5th, 2019, one of those late summer evenings in Springfield, Illinois, when the sun turns everything gold and kind right before it sets and takes the warmth with it. I had just finished paying the first quarter tuition for Eli and June's enrichment program at Hawthorne, $2,100, signed at First Midwest Bank teller initials DK, because Rachel, my daughter-in-law, had whispered last week about keeping them ahead. Of course I said yes. You say yes to the future. You say yes to your grandchildren. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. I pulled into the Springfield Elementary parking lot a little before 6. The PTA banners flapped lazily in the warm breeze, cicadas hummed like distant sprinklers, and I tucked the crisp receipt into the inside pocket of my navy blazer. Helen picked out that blazer years ago. She loved how the shoulders fit. I retired that spring after 37 years as a high school principal, and this was my first open house as just Grandpa Jensen. Michael met me by the bulletin board inside. His tie was crooked, his smile a little too quick. He hugged me, but his eyes flicked over my shoulder, checking for Rachel. "Dad," he said softly, "thanks again for covering that thing." "You mean the program tuition?" I patted my pocket. "Yeah. I've got the receipt right here." He rubbed his forehead. "She sips just stressed. You know how she gets." That's Michael's way of saying, "Please don't make this harder than it already is." Rachel arrived a moment later. Perfectly put together. She didn't walk so much as glide, like someone expecting a camera flash. She kissed my cheek without touching me, and looped her arm through Michael's. "We stir going to Mrs. Alvarez's sisters class," she said. "Blue Hall. Try not to confuse the schedule, Jensen." That word, confuse. As if I hadn't built schedules for thousands of students and staff for decades. As if I didn't keep this family standing when Michael lost his job twice. But I smiled, like I always do. You let small things slide when you want to keep a family whole. The school hallways smelled like pencil shavings and fresh wax. Children's drawings lined the walls, lopsided houses, suns with too many rays, stick families holding hands. I nodded at the Harrisons, my neighbors, as they passed. "See you Sunday," Mrs. Harrison mouthed. "Lemon bars, she always brings lemon bars." Inside Mrs. Alvarez's classroom, I found Eli's name on a paper rocket, carefully printed in block letters. June had drawn a heart next to hers. I touched them both gently, like pressing a seal into wax. Mrs. Alvarez spotted me from across the room and lit up. "Mr. Miller, the legend himself. She student taught under me years ago. How sips retirement?" "I'm learning to sleep past 5:30, I said. Laughter rippled through the parents. I shook hands, introduced myself. People knew me here, that mattered. And Rachel felt it. I saw it in the way her shoulders tightened. During the presentation, she drifted to the back and started whispering to a woman in a tan sweater. I wasn't listening at first, but as chairs scraped and parents filtered out, a few words floated across the room. Clear, sharp. "He sets. A relic," Rachel said. "Honestly, he sets kind of a bad influence. I sets him trying to set boundaries. He thinks writing a check means he gets an opinion." She laughed. The kind of laugh you use to audition allies. The PTA treasurer walked past with cupcakes, glanced at me like she'd overheard a fight in a grocery store aisle, and kept going. I didn't say anything. I just steadied myself against the doorframe. In my pocket, the receipt crinkled like dry leaves. Bad influence. I thought of the nights Helen and I stretched a single teacher's salary to keep our home warm. I thought of Michael's first bike, the porch light glowing while he wobbled down the block. I thought of the mortgage checks I mailed during his rough years. All of it, a lifetime of steadiness, collapsed into a whispered insult. Outside, the air was heavy and soft. The kids tugged me toward the playground. "Grandpa, there's Sips a hedgehog in class," Eli yelled. "His name's Sips Quilliam." "Very literary," I said, smiling. June slipped me a folded drawing. Our house, blue door, maple tree, me on the swing. She'd written home in pink marker at the top. I tucked it into my pocket beside the receipt. Two truths, folded together. At the PTA table, Rachel leaned over the treasurer. We still take October snacks, she chirped. I can drive for the field trip, I said, already writing my name in my careful principal's handwriting. Rachel Sepp's smile froze. Maybe let us Sepps get our rhythm first, with the kids, you know. The sign-up is open to everyone, the treasurer added quietly, almost apologetic. I did not push, but I noticed the drive home was quiet. South Grand MacArthur Vane Street. The sun dipped low, turning the houses copper. June's drawing lay on the passenger seat. Holmes staring up at me. My house smelled like lemon oil and old wood. I hung my blazer, set the papers on the table, and noticed something strange. The chipped key hook by the door. 3 brass hooks, same as always. Only this time the spare key wasn't hanging there. I checked the ceramic dish on the console table, the windowsill, even under the mail stack. Nothing. That empty hook felt louder than Rachel Sepp's words. I brewed a cup of coffee, though it was late. Coffee steadies my hands. I slipped the Hawthorne receipt and June's drawing into a manila folder labeled Family in Helen's handwriting. Under the date, August 28, 2019, I underlined once, slow. I added a note, open house 9/5. Rachel comment, spare key missing. A text buzzed from Michael. Thanks for tonight. Don't worry about the key. Rachel grabbed it, said it looked messy. We'll figure stuff out. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Then I turned it face down. Later, I walked the perimeter. Front door, back door, windows. The motion light flared on over the back stoop, casting my shadow across the concrete. Helen's gardening gloves hung stiff on their peg, frozen mid-gesture. I clicked the deadbolt softly, like sealing a thought. Lying in bed, I listened to the clock tick. The house breathed. People think betrayal crashes in with thunder. But it doesn't. It starts with whispers you weren't meant to hear. A missing key, a text written by someone else's hand. On the first page of Helen Epps' old notebook, I wrote, September 5th, 2019. Open house. Rachel called me a bad influence. Spare key missing. Hawthorne tuition $2,100. Teller DK. I closed it. I didn't know it then, but that was the first entry in what would become my ledger. The betrayal had begun. Quietly, precisely, and I had just pressed record without even knowing it. They say heartbreak comes in one big blow, but that's not true. Real betrayal bleeds in through the cracks. Small cuts you don't even feel at first. By the time you notice, you're already standing in a puddle. Winter turned to spring, spring to summer, and somewhere between birthday cupcakes and lockdown press conferences, Rachel started shrinking my world inch by inch. It began subtly, a canceled Sunday lunch here, a the kids are tired text there. I told myself not to overthink it. People get busy. Life shifts, but then COVID hit, and distance became a weapon she didn't even have to hide. By April 2020, Springfield Elementary had closed its doors. We were all stuck at home. I'd set up a little classroom in my den, 2 desks from a local thrift store, laminated name tags for Eli and June, a stack of workbooks. I FaceTimed them 3 afternoons a week to help with reading and math. At first, Rachel thanked me for the help. You're a lifesaver, she'd text. They love Grandpa's school. But slowly her tone shifted. One Wednesday in May, I logged on at our usual time. No answer. I tried again. Nothing. 10 minutes later, Michael texted, Hey Dad, Rachel says they're doing a family activity tonight. Rain check? No explanation, no warning, just gone. That became a pattern. Calls cut short, homework sessions forgotten, and Michael's voice on the phone, flattened, rehearsed, like a man reading lines written for him. One night I asked him gently, Is everything all right? He exhaled. Yeah, it's just, you know how she is. We said you're just trying to keep things simple. Simple? I said. My reading that Charlotte Sepp's web ispid with your daughter, not litigating custody. Silence. Then the faint sound of Rachel calling his name in the background, sharp like a bell. "Gotta go, Dad," he said. Click. The house grew quieter that summer. Not because of the pandemic, but because of her. Rachel controlled the narrative like a careful editor, trimming out anything that didn't serve her story. Then came June 18th, 2020. A Thursday. I remember because the clock over my kitchen sink had just clicked past 8 p.m., and the air was thick enough to taste. I was sorting through tax files when a crumpled slip of paper slid out of Michael's old folder. It was a bank transfer confirmation, $28,000, from my account to Michael and Rachel's joint mortgage, dated March 3rd, 2020. I'd made the transfer quietly to help them avoid foreclosure during the first COVID panic. At the time, Rachel had thanked me through gritted teeth, and Michael had promised, "We'll pay it back once things stabilize." I flattened the paper on the counter. The numbers glared back at me in stark black print. $28,000. No thank you notes, no acknowledgement, just silence. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the stillness, each second carving itself into memory. That night, something shifted inside me. Not anger, not yet, clarity. I opened Helen Sipp's old notebook again and started a new page. June 18th, 2020, $28,000 transfer. March 3rd, found slip while sorting taxes. No repayment, not mentioned since. Below that I wrote, "Begin journal." I wasn't plotting revenge. Not then. I was preserving reality. Because reality, when you're being quietly erased, is the first casualty. I started journaling every interaction. Dates, times, what was said, who initiated the call, how long it lasted. I printed screenshots of texts and tucked them between notebook pages like pressed leaves. June 23rd. Rachel cancels Sunday call, says screen fatigue. July 4th. Kids wave from car but don't come in. Rachel says COVID bubbles, neighbors see. August 2nd. Michael says they'll try to make Labor Day. The erosion was quiet, like water wearing down stone. I also began noticing financial threads I'd never pulled before. Over the years, I'd paid their Hawthorne tuition, $8,400 a year for enrichment programs, soccer registration, school trips. It wasn't about control, it was about giving the kids opportunities. But Rachel had started framing it differently. "We appreciate your help, Jensen," she'd say, emphasis on your help, like it was charity, not family legacy. She began saying things like, "They need to learn to rely on us more," as if my presence was a problem to solve. By September 2020, it had been 6 months since I'd seen the kids in person. Rachel's COVID bubble included her Pilates instructor and her sister's family in Naperville, but apparently not me. I'd watch from my porch as they drove by on their way to outdoor birthday parties. Eli's little hand pressed to the window. They'd wave, Rachel wouldn't even look. One Sunday evening, as the leaves began to turn, Michael called. "Dad," he said. His voice was low. "Rachel thinks the kids are picking up some habits from you that aren't set helpful." "Habits?" I asked. "Like reading books? Saying D, please, sift online, and thank you. Sift online D, and asking questions." He sighed. "She says you are too strict, old-fashioned. It seps confusing them." That word again. Confusing. "Michael," I said quietly, "do you remember who taught you how to tie a tie, how to stand up straight in a room, how to finish what you start?" He didn't stop answer. In the background, I heard Rachel say, "Hang up now." Click. That was the night I understood something essential. This wasn't neglect. This was deliberate rewriting. Rachel was crafting a story where I was the villain, and Michael, God help him, was letting her. So I sharpened my pen. I backed up every bank statement. I downloaded PDF copies of each tuition transfer, time-stamped and labeled. I created a folder on my computer called Legacy, hidden behind tax records, where I scanned letters from teachers, thank you cards, even Eli's drawings. I began to think like the principal I used to be, calm, methodical. Document everything. On November 10th, 2020, the last of the maple leaves fell outside my kitchen window. I sat there with a cup of black coffee, Helen's notebook open, and realized my grief had shape now. It wasn't just sadness, it was structure. Rachel thought she was isolating me. What she didn't know was that isolation gave me time, and time is where people like me build their cases. The small cuts kept coming, but so did my notes, and quietly, without anyone realizing, the ledger was growing teeth. By spring of 2021, my grief had calcified into something solid. The empty Sundays, the unanswered calls, the carefully curated excuses, they'd stopped stinging. Now they just left impressions, like fossils pressed into wet stone, and fossils, unlike feelings, are evidence. I had spent the winter quietly gathering threads, but that March I began weaving them into something deliberate. A ledger, not a scrapbook, not a diary. A ledger structured, indexed, dated. The kind of document that doesn't ask for sympathy. It demands attention. March 2nd, 2021. A Tuesday, I cleared my dining table and spread everything out under the warm light of the overhead lamp. Bank statements, transfer receipts, tuition checks, screenshots of texts printed and clipped by month. Each stack represented a year. Each folder a category: financial, communication, school, community. Helen's notebook lay open at the top like a general's journal before a campaign. I'd been a principal for nearly 4 decades. My entire career was built on tracking hundreds of moving parts, anticipating human behavior, and creating systems no one could manipulate. Rachel thought isolation would make me forgettable. She'd forgotten who she was dealing with. I started with the bank records. Between 2019 and 2021, I had transferred $92,000 to Michael and Rachel, house payments, tuition, emergencies, soccer fees. Every amount matched a note in my journal. I highlighted each in yellow and wrote the date and purpose in the margins. $2,100 for Hawthorne enrichment, $8,400 for annual tuition, $3,750 for home repairs after a burst pipe in February 2020. Then came the tuition receipts. I found 3 years' worth tucked neatly in an old filing box labeled Education Miller. Helen had made that box. She always believed legacies should be traceable. Each receipt had the school year and both children's names handwritten by me in blue ink. I scanned them all, named them precisely. Hawthorne _ tuition _ 2019 _ Q1.pdf, and so on, and backed them up on an encrypted external drive I kept in my desk drawer. By the end of that first week, my dining table looked like a legal war room, and in a way that's what it was becoming. The next step wasn't set paperwork. It was people. Springfield is a small town in the way most Midwestern towns are small. Everyone knows everyone's business by dinner. Ely and June's teachers remembered me, not just as Grandpa, but as Mr. Miller, the principal who wrote personal recommendation letters for students he'd only known for a semester. They'd seen me at every PTA meeting, every field trip sign-up, every after-school program. I wasn't some distant relative trying to insert himself. I was there consistently. I started reaching out, not with accusations, but with warmth. A call here, a check-in email there. By March 15th, I'd spoken to 3 teachers. All of them, without prompting, mentioned how involved I'd been in the kids' education. Mrs. Collins, Eli Sepp's homeroom teacher, said, "Honestly, Mr. Miller, you have been more consistent than some parents. I wish every kid had a grandparent like you. I just try to help where I can." I replied, my voice steady. She laughed softly. "Help? You ran the reading corner for half of fall semester. That wasn't set help. That was leadership." Those conversations mattered, not for validation but for record. On March 20th, I asked each of them carefully if they'd be willing to put their observations in writing, not as legal statements, just as personal letters for the family. They all agreed. By early April, I had 3 signed letters on Springfield Elementary letterhead praising my involvement and reliability. They weren't legal documents, but they were powerful character evidence. I stored them in a new binder labeled simply, "Support." Meanwhile, on the home front, small signs of Rachel's tightening control kept surfacing. On April 8th, I stopped by their house, unannounced, to drop off a box of Eli's old science kits. Michael opened the door halfway, shoulders hunched. "Hey, Dad," he said, almost whispering. Eli peeked from behind his leg. Grandpa. Rachel Sepp's voice sliced through the hallway like a piano wire. We Sepps are busy, Jensen. You can Sepps just show up. I them dropping off some educational kits, I said evenly. Thought Eli might enjoy them. She folded her arms. You should Sepp called first. Boundaries. I handed the box to Michael. He took it without meeting my eyes. I caught sight of a new lock on the side gate as I left. Brass, heavy duty, freshly installed. I noted it in my journal when I got home. April 8th, 2021. Unannounced visit. Rachel Hostal. New lock on side gate. The locks were more symbolic than practical. Rachel wasn't just locking me out of their house. She was locking me out of their narrative. But I was already ahead. Over chess one Sunday afternoon, I told my friend Leonard Hayes about what had been happening. Leonard had been my chess partner for years. Sharp mind, steady hands, a retired attorney with a fondness for quiet strategies. He moved his bishop, trapping my rook, and said, You stir not collecting memories anymore, Jensen. You stir gathering pieces. Pieces for what? I asked. He looked at me over his glasses. For when the game stops being friendly, that conversation stuck with me. By late April, I formalized my system. 3 binders: financial, correspondence, community, each tabbed, indexed, dated, a separate accordion file for original receipts and documents. Digital backups mirrored everything. I even kept a small notebook in my truck's glove compartment to jot quick observations during drive-bys or doorstep encounters. On April 29th, I changed the locks on my own house. 3 new keys, logged and stored. 1 in my desk, 1 in a fireproof safe, 1 in a sealed envelope at the bank. The spare hook by the door remained empty. Permanently. I made sure of that. I wasn't just protecting my home. I was drawing a line. By the time May rolled around, my grief had structure, my evidence had form, and my patience had purpose. Rachel thought she was quietly erasing me. What she didn't realize was that I was turning every brushstroke of her deception into an exhibit. She had control of the family dynamic. But I had the ledger. By November 2021, Rachel had gotten comfortable. Too comfortable. She'd spent 2 years building a quiet, curated version of reality, one where I was the overbearing relic in the background. Easy to dismiss, easy to frame. But comfort breeds carelessness, and masks always slip when people start believing their own performance. It happened on a Friday night, November 12th. PTA night at Springfield Elementary. The air was cold and sharp, the kind that makes your breath visible and your thoughts clearer. I wore the same navy blazer Helen had picked for me years ago. It had become my quiet armor. In the inside pocket, I carried a small, legal digital recorder. Illinois is a one-party consent state. Years as a principal teach you that the best evidence doesn't announce itself. It just listens. The gym was transformed into a PTA showcase. Tables with cupcakes, trifold boards displaying reading stats, and teachers buzzing between parents like bees. Familiar faces greeted me warmly. Springfield remembers its people. The Harrisons waved from the punch table. Mrs. Collins, Eli's teacher, pulled me aside to tell me how much she appreciated the extra reading materials I'd dropped off last month. Small affirmations, the kind Rachel couldn't edit. I saw her before she saw me. Rachel stood near the bleachers, a glass of boxed Chardonnay in hand, surrounded by 2 other mothers. Her posture was perfect, practiced, like she was hosting her own talk show. Michael hovered a few feet behind, smiling on cue, hands in his pockets. His face had that tense, glassy look, the one he wore during arguments he'd already lost. I moved closer, staying in the flow of parents milling about. The recorder clicked on smoothly in my pocket. Old-fashioned parenting. Rachel was saying, her voice just loud enough to carry. He means well, but honestly, it's Sepp's exhausting. He thinks the world still works the way it did in the 80s. The kids don't need lectures. They need freedom. Boundaries. I Sepp setting boundaries. Tan sweater mom nodded eagerly. But isn't he like super involved? Teachers love him, right? Rachel laughed lightly. Yeah, that's Sip's part of the problem. He inserts himself everywhere. PTA, classroom reading, soccer signups. It's Sips controlling. I keep telling Michael one day we as are going to have to draw a legal line. He doesn't get it. My stomach tightened. Legal line. It wasn't idle talk anymore. She was floating narratives, testing reactions, and Tan Sweater Mom gave her exactly what she wanted, validation. I stayed still, blending into the background like the old school administrator I'd been for decades. If Rachel wanted an audience, I'd give her one. A silent one, a recording one. Later that evening, after the PTA speeches ended and parents began filtering out, Principal Henderson pulled me aside. Jensen, she said quietly, I need to give you something. She handed me a manila envelope. Inside was a printed copy of a letter Rachel had submitted 2 weeks earlier. Complaint about me? I asked. She nodded. It's such as vague. She mentioned concerns about their involvement, Setchus and Haig confusing family roles. Such as legally I had to document it, but there's such as nothing actionable. I thought you should see it. The letter was typed. Formal. Cold. Rachel framed me as well-intentioned but intrusive, questioning my influence on the children's emotional development. She'd cede Michael, the PTA board, and the district liaison. It wasn't an outright attack. It was a foundation, a paper trail she could build on later. I thanked Principal Henderson, slipped the letter into my folder, and walked back to my car under the brittle November stars. In the driver's seat, I read the letter again under the dome light. My hands didn't shake. They used to, but not anymore. I'd expected this. She was playing her hand, and I was documenting every card. The following weeks turned quieter. Rachel must have sensed that she'd pushed something into motion. Calls were more formal. Michael's texts grew shorter. The kids were always busy, but under that quiet something else was forming, a current she didn't see. On November 21st, I met Leonard at his house for our usual Sunday chess. He poured us coffee, black and strong. The board between us was familiar territory, but that night the game mirrored our conversation. She sips laying groundwork, Leonard said, as he advanced his knight. Complaint letters. Social narratives. Classic pre-litigation maneuvering. She sips preparing to isolate you legally. I know, I said. Sliding my rook into position, that sips why I recorded the PTA conversation. His eyebrows lifted. Good, don't use it yet. Just keep preserving. Remember, Jensen's strategy isn't set about the next move. It sets about the move after that. By early December, Michael called one evening. His voice was tired. Dad, he said, maybe you could back off a little, just to keep the peace. Rachel seps. She seps, under pressure. I leaned back in my chair. Michael, do you know what she said at PTA night? Silence. She sips, talking about legal lines. Complaints, you think backing off sips will make that stop? It sips till just make her bolder. He didn't respond right away. Then quietly, I said, sorry, Dad. I don't know what to do anymore. Before I could say more, Rachel Sips's voice cut in from the background, sharp as broken glass. Hang up. Click. The call ended. I stared at the dark screen for a long moment. That sorry wasn't strategy, it was resignation. Michael was already choosing the path of least resistance, even if it meant stepping aside while Rachel tried to erase me. But I wasn't stepping aside. That night I labeled the audio file from PTA as PTA_NOV12_2021_RachelBoundaries.wav, embedded the original metadata, and backed it up on 2 separate drives. I slid Principal Henderson Seftis envelope into the correspondence binder under our day, then I made a note in my ledger. November 12, 2021. PTA recording Rachel discussing legal line boundaries. November 14, 2021. Received copy of complaint letter. November 21, 2021. Leonard pre-litigation maneuvering discussion. December du Vergola 2021. Michael call, resignation tone, Rachel interference. Rachel's mask had slipped, and I'd caught it on paper, on tape, and in witness accounts. She thought she was setting the stage. She didn't realize I was building the courtroom. Springfield winters have a way of testing what's solid. The cold creeps into wood, splits it if there's any weakness. By February 2022, the same thing was happening to my family. The fractures Rachel had spent 2 years tapping into were finally widening into fault lines. The snow came early that year. By mid-January, the sidewalks were crusted over, every breath forming clouds in the night air. I'd settled into a quiet rhythm, mornings with coffee in my ledger, afternoons cataloging documents, evenings alone in the house Helen and I built. The spare key hook by the door remained empty, like a quiet dare to anyone who remembered what used to hang there. On January 12th, Michael called after weeks of silence. His voice was thin, like he was speaking through a cracked window. "Dad, can you maybe hold off on dropping by?" he said. Rachel Sebs saying it, Sebs disruptive. Disruptive, I repeated. I dropped off their winter coats last week because it was 7 degrees outside, and Eli Sepp's sleeves were too short. Disruptive? It's Seto's just easier, he murmured. For now. Easier for who, Michael? He didn't answer. He just sighed, the kind of sigh that means surrender, not thought. After the call, I made a note in the ledger. January 12th, 2022. Michael Call requested reduced visits. Rachel claimed disruptive, noted tone passive, resigned. Rachel's isolation campaign was reaching its mature stage. She wasn't improvising anymore, she was enforcing. I adjusted accordingly. By late January, the Harrisons mentioned, in that careful Midwestern way, that they'd seen Rachel driving by my house more often than usual. Maybe she's checking on the kids' drop-offs, Mrs. Harrison said. But her eyes told me she didn't believe that explanation any more than I did. February 14th, 2022. A Monday. The snow had hardened into gray slabs at the edges of the driveway, and the air was brittle enough to make door hinges complain. I was inside preparing a pot of Helen's chili recipe when the porch light sensor clicked on. I glanced at the monitor by the kitchen door, a small security system I'd installed years ago after a rash of break-ins in the neighborhood. The grainy black and white feed showed Rachel on my front porch. Hood up, no car in sight. She wasn't knocking. She wasn't delivering anything. She was peering through the front window like someone inspecting a property listing. She turned, jiggled the doorknob once, then walked away quickly down the path. My hands went still on the ladle. I replayed the footage twice, then exported it to a flash drive. I labeled the file porchcam_feb 14_2022_rachelcheck.mp4 and noted the timestamp 6:48 p.m. The next day, February 15th, I sent the video to Leonard with a brief note. Subject: Rachel activity, preserved footage. Possible escalation. His reply came less than an hour later. Good. Back it up. Don't sit confront her. Document only. You set her ahead of her timeline. That night, after cleaning up the kitchen, I sat at the table with Helen's gardening gloves resting on the edge like quiet witnesses. I opened my laptop and pulled up the audio files, receipts, complaint letters, and teacher statements. One by one, I backed everything up to a secondary encrypted drive and stored it in my fireproof safe. Then I opened my ledger and wrote carefully, February 14th, 2022. Rachel seen on porch. Security footage preserved. Sent to Leonard. February 15th, 2022. Backup of all key evidence completed. I stared at the page. She thought she was tightening control. She didn't see the rope coiling around her own feet. The next significant shift came in late February. On the 24th, I received a certified letter from Rachel's lawyer, not a petition yet, but a notice of concern, citing my unsupervised interactions with the children and interference in parental decision-making. It was couched in vague language, more posturing than substance, but it marked the moment this stopped being an internal family conflict. It was now moving into legal terrain. I called Leonard immediately. He picked up on the second ring. She seps probing, he said flatly after I read him the letter. This is how they test how you sept-till respond. She seps trying to see if you sept-till get defensive or emotional. Don't sept. We stay factual. I figured as much, I said. This is good, Jensen, he added. Every time she moves, she leaves a paper trail. And you? You'd been laying track for 3 years. His confidence steadied me. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about timing. In early March, the Harrisons hosted a small neighborhood dinner. Rachel and Michael didn't come, but the absence was loud. People whispered, not maliciously, but with that Springfield mix of curiosity and loyalty. They'd seen me with the kids for years. They'd watched me support every fundraiser, attend every game, quietly keep this family running. And now, Rachel's curated story didn't fit the community's memories. That evening, Mrs. Harrison pulled me aside in the kitchen. Jensen, she said, I don't set know what sep's going on, but people notice things. She can set rewrite history here. I gave a small nod. She sips trying, I said. But history keeps better records than she does. By March 10th, the winter chill was starting to ease, but the legal storm was just gathering. Rachel's maneuvering had moved from whispers to letters, from control to surveillance. She thought she was tightening a noose around my access to Eli in June, but with every move she left evidence. And evidence is my terrain. Before turning in one night, I opened my ledger and flipped through the pages. Bank transfers, complaint letters, teacher statements, recorded conversations, surveillance footage, all meticulously dated and cross-referenced. It was more than a collection now. It was a timeline, a map. Rachel believed she was isolating me. In reality, she was defining the perimeter of her own undoing. Winter had drawn its lines clearly, and I had marked every one of them in ink. July 15th, 2022, started like any other summer Friday in Springfield, humid, heavy, and deceptively quiet. By noon, the sky had turned that pale, washed-out blue that makes everything feel still, like the world is holding its breath. I was in my den, sorting through some old report cards I'd saved from my years as principal, when the doorbell rang. The Harrisons were out of town. The mail had already come. That left two possibilities: sales pitch or legal delivery. I opened the door to find a process server standing on my porch, envelope in hand, mask pulled below his chin to fight the heat. Jensen Miller? He asked. Yes. He handed me the thick manila envelope, nodded, and left without ceremony. I stood there for a long moment, the weight of it sitting in my hands like a sealed verdict. Inside was a formal petition to restrict visitation, filed by Rachel's attorney on July 12th. Her claim my psychological influence was allegedly causing emotional confusion and instability in Eli in June. She requested that all visitation be suspended pending court review. The wording was slick, polished, legally cautious, but every line dripped with Rachel's fingerprints. She finally made her move. I sat down at the dining table, spread out the petition, and read it twice, slowly. My fingers traced the embossed seal at the top of the first page. I'd spent decades reviewing disciplinary reports, legal letters, parent complaints, but reading your own family framed in legal language is something different. It's cold, surgical. Rachel's claims were vague but strategic. She cited conflicting parenting methods, over-involvement in educational decisions, and unilateral financial contributions. She portrayed herself as a mother protecting her children from a destabilizing outside force. I recognized the playbook. She was reframing 3 years of generosity and consistency into grounds for exclusion. At the back of the packet was a proposed temporary visitation restriction order, unsigned but ready for a judge's pen. For a few minutes I just stared at the papers. The house was silent except for the creak of the old ceiling fan. Then I exhaled slowly, stood, and went to my study. I opened the fireproof safe, pulled out my correspondence binder, and placed the petition neatly between the November complaint letter and the lawyer's notice of concern from February. I picked up the phone and called Leonard. He answered on the second ring. She filed it, I said. Good, he replied instantly. His tone was calm, almost satisfied. She just gave us everything we need on paper. I could hear the faint scrape of his chess pieces being set down. Jensen, he continued, this is the moment we've been preparing for. She's moved from whispers to legal filings. Now she's in my arena, and yours. We scheduled a meeting for the following Monday, July 18th, at his office downtown. That weekend, Springfield baked under a heat wave, but inside my house it felt like early winter, cold, crisp, purposeful. I spent Saturday pulling every relevant document from my system. Tuition receipts, bank transfers, character letters, complaint correspondence, audio files, the porch camera footage. I printed a fresh index page and numbered every document meticulously. Hawthorne enrichment receipts, 2019, 2022, bank transfers, breakdown of $92,000. Teacher character letters, spring 2021. PTA audio recording, November 20, Rachel complaint letter, November 2021. Lawyer notice of concern, February 2022. Porch cam footage, February 14th, 2022. By Sunday evening, the financial correspondence and community binders were stacked neatly on the table, each one tabbed and indexed. I slipped everything into a leather portfolio I'd kept from my principal days. Old habits die hard. July 18th, 9 a.m. sharp, I walked into Leonard's office on Adams Street. The waiting area smelled like lemon polish and old legal pads. Leonard greeted me wearing a crisp white shirt, sleeves already rolled up. He looked like a man about to start a chess game he knew he could win. He flipped through the petition quickly, making small marks with a black fountain pen. "She SEP's relying on vagueness," he said. "No hard evidence, just emotional language and framing. It won SEPT hold if we bring the facts." He tapped the PTA audio recording listed in my index. "This alone cuts through half her claims. Add the receipts, letters, and your spotless record, and she sits walking into a storm she built herself." We spent 3 hours building our initial response strategy. Leonard drafted a formal reply outlining factual inaccuracies in Rachel's petition. We included the timeline of financial support, school involvement, and character references, all backed by documentation. His assistant scanned and logged each page for court submission. By noon, the plan was set. Step 1. File a motion opposing the visitation restriction. Step 2. Submit character letters and financial documentation to establish long-term involvement. Step 3. Prepare to introduce the PTA audio recording if Rachel's narrative escalated during hearing. As I left Leonard's office, I passed a mural on the side of the courthouse wall. It depicted a tree with deep roots winding beneath a small town. I paused, looking at it longer than I meant to. Legacy doesn't announce itself loudly. It just stays rooted until the storm comes. Rachel thought this letter was her victory. She didn't realize she'd just stepped into a courtroom where truth doesn't bend to curated stories. That night, back home, I logged the petition into my ledger. July 15th, 2022. Petition to restrict visitation received. Claims psychological influence. Over-involvement. Filed July 12th. July 18th, 2022. Met with Leonard. Strategy finalized. Evidence indexed and prepared. I slid the ledger shut. For the first time in 3 years, the path ahead was sharp and clear. Rachel had bared her teeth. She didn't realize I'd spent years sharpening mine quietly, in ink, on paper with dates and signatures. The game had officially changed. December 5th, 2022, Springfield County Courthouse. The morning air carried that brittle pre-snow sharpness that makes every breath feel like glass. I parked 2 blocks away deliberately, choosing to walk through the cold instead of pulling up to the steps like everyone else. Nerves? No, ritual. I'd done the same thing before every serious disciplinary hearing during my years as principal. Walking gives you time to remember who you are before the storm begins. I wore my navy suit pressed the night before, shoes polished like Helen used to insist. In my leather portfolio were the 3 binders: financial, correspondence, community, and the original PTA audio recording device, batteries checked twice. The Harrisons had offered to attend as character witnesses. The teachers had already submitted their letters. Leonard walked beside me, carrying nothing but a slim legal folder. He didn't need props. He had precision. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with that specific kind of controlled chaos. Lawyers murmuring, shoes clicking on marble, the faint echo of shuffling papers. We found our courtroom on the 2nd floor. Wooden benches, high ceiling, the state flag limp against the paneled wall. Rachel and Michael were already there. She wore a dark green dress, perfectly pressed, hair styled to perfection. She looked like someone auditioning for the role of devoted mother. Michael looked smaller than I remembered, tie too loose, eyes tired. He avoided my gaze, staring down at his phone like it held a different life. Rachel's lawyer, a man named Callahan, approached Leonard briefly. Polite handshake. No small talk. They both knew what today was not negotiation but exposure. At 9 a.m. sharp, the judge entered, a woman in her early 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for cutting through nonsense. This hearing is now in session, she said. Petition 22 CV 317, Miller v. Miller. Petition to restrict visitation rights. Hearing my own name in a legal case title still felt surreal, like reading an obituary while you're still breathing. Callahan began with the usual formalities, laying out Rachel's petition. He spoke in measured tones, presenting me as a well-meaning but interfering presence, someone who blurred familial roles and complicated the children's emotional development. He leaned heavily on Rachel's complaint letter, her vague references to confusion, and the fact that I'd provided financial support unilaterally. Rachel dabbed at the corner of her eye with a tissue as he spoke, a performance calibrated to the rhythm of his sentences. I watched her calmly. Every emotional beat she played, I had evidence to counter. Leonard rose when it was our turn. He didn't posture. He didn't raise his voice. He began with the timeline. Your Honor, he said, this is a case about legacy, consistency, and documented fact. Over the course of 3 years, my client, Mr. Jensen Miller, has not only been a stable presence in his grandchildren's lives, he has been instrumental in their education, their financial stability, and their community upbringing. The petitioner's narrative relies on vague emotional language. Ours relies on evidence. He opened the financial binder first, walking the judge through the $92,000 in documented transfers from 2019 to 2022. He placed copies of receipts, checks, and bank statements on the evidence table, each one labeled and indexed. $8,400 per year, Leonard said, tapping one page lightly, paid directly to Hawthorne Enrichment. These funds ensured uninterrupted education during critical developmental years, including during the COVID-19 lockdown. Then he opened the community binder. Teacher letters, PTA involvement records. My consistent attendance documented across seasons, years, and events. He read excerpts from Mrs. Collins' Sefted letter. Mr. Miller Sipp's involvement in Eli and June Sipps's education has been exemplary. His presence has been a stabilizing force both academically and emotionally. The judge read the letter silently, nodding once. Finally, Leonard queued up the PTA audio recording from November 12, 2021. He had already filed a notice of intent to use it weeks earlier. The judge gave a small nod. Leonard pressed play. Rachel Sepp's voice filled the courtroom. Yeah, that sista's part of the problem. He inserts himself everywhere. PTA, classroom reading, soccer sign-ups. It's sista's controlling. I keep telling Michael one day we sister going to have to draw a legal line. He doesn't sisted get it. The recording echoed through the high-ceilinged room. Her own words, her own tone, her own mask slipping in public. Michael closed his eyes slowly, like someone realizing too late that a house fire started weeks ago in the walls. Rachel's jaw tightened, a flicker of panic barely contained. Callahan shifted in his seat. The judge leaned forward slightly. That Sips her voice? Yes, Your Honor, Leonard replied. Recorded lawfully at a public PTA event. Notice of evidence submitted November 20th. The judge nodded. Continue. Leonard concluded by emphasizing my consistent role in the children's lives, the lack of any concrete evidence of harm, and Rachel's documented attempts to marginalize me through complaints and legal maneuvers rather than mediation or discussion. He didn't paint her as a villain. He didn't need to. Her own actions were enough. Callahan attempted a rebuttal, pointing to changing family dynamics and Rachel's maternal instincts, but the momentum had shifted. Evidence carries a gravity that performance can't counter. At 11:17 a.m., after reviewing documents and conferring briefly with the clerk, the judge spoke. Miss Miller, she said, addressing Rachel directly, this petition does not demonstrate sufficient grounds to restrict Mr. Miller's visitation. In fact, the documentation suggests a consistent positive role in the children's upbringing. Filing vague complaints while accepting substantial educational and financial support does not reflect well on your petition. Rachel's face froze, the practiced composure fracturing for a heartbeat. Michael stared at the floor. The judge continued, I am denying the petition to restrict visitation. Instead, I will order a mediated consent schedule to formalize visitation rights, ensuring clarity for all parties involved. I also advise you, Miss Miller, to exercise caution in making further unsubstantiated claims. The gavel struck once, crisp as ice cracking. It was over. Not the whole war, but this decisive battle. Rachel stood slowly, color rising in her cheeks. She didn't look at me. Michael finally did, just for a second. His face wasn't defiant. It was hollow. Regret has a particular look, and his wore it plainly. Leonard packed his folder with surgical calm. As we stepped into the hallway, reporters weren't waiting. This wasn't that kind of case. But the quiet murmurs of other families echoed around us. The Harrisons caught my eye from the bench near the elevators. Mrs. Harrison mouthed, Good job. Outside, the air had warmed slightly, but the sky was heavy, a storm teasing the horizon. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold settle into my lungs, sharp but clean. Leonard clapped a hand on my shoulder. You didn't stop just win, Jensen, he said. You proved. And that, more than anything, is what Rachel had underestimated. She thought this was about emotion. I had made it about evidence. The thing about courtroom victories is that they don't end when the gavel falls. They echo through families, through communities, through the tiny spaces between people who once pretended not to see. After December 5th, 2022, Rachel's immaculate facade didn't shatter all at once. It cracked, and those cracks spread fast. The very next morning, I walked into McKinley's Cafe on Vine Street. My usual spot, black coffee, corner table, same as I'd done for years. But this time, heads turned. Not dramatically, just small, knowing nods. Springfield isn't a big city. News doesn't travel. It seeps like warm coffee into a napkin. PTA parents talk. Teachers talk. The courthouse clerks have cousins in the soccer league. By breakfast, people knew. Mrs. Collins spotted me first. She walked over, mask pulled down around her chin. Eyes warm. Mr. Miller, she said. I heard about the hearing. Good for you. I nodded modestly. Truth has a way of walking on its own 2 feet. She laughed softly. Rachel Sepp's been busy, you know, whispering. I think people are finally starting to see through it. That was the real shift, not legal but social. Rachel had spent years curating a version of events where she was the misunderstood mother fending off the meddling patriarch. But the PTA recording, the teacher letters, and the judge's ruling had stripped that version bare. You can't unring a bell once it's been struck in public. By the end of that week, 2 different parents approached me at separate times. Each said some variation of, I always thought something didn't add up. One even mentioned overhearing Rachel at a holiday fundraiser last year, going on about boundaries as if laying groundwork. Retrospect sharpens memory. Meanwhile, Rachel grew quieter in public. Her usual overconfident posture at school events was gone. She attended the Winter Choir concert on December 14th, but instead of her usual front row center spot, she lingered at the side, arms crossed. Michael stood beside her, looking like a man caught between 2 collapsing walls. He didn't speak to me that night, but his eyes did. Regret isn't loud. It's a glance you don't want to give but can't stop from escaping. 3 days later, December 17th, I stopped by the school office to drop off a stack of gently used books for the library. The receptionist, Patty, leaned in conspiratorially. You know, she whispered, Rachel quietly withdrew her complaint from the district file yesterday. Said it was no longer relevant. I didn't need to ask why. She was retreating, trying to erase the paper trail she'd built now that it had turned against her. But Springfield is a town that remembers paper might be shredded, but reputations leave outlines. I logged the withdrawal into my ledger that afternoon, December 17th, 2022. Rachel withdrew school complaint. Likely response to court ruling. Community chatter increasing. That same evening, Michael called. It was late. Almost 10 p.m., and his voice was quieter than usual. "Dad," he began. "Why didn't Set you tell me everything? The recordings, the binders, all of it." I sat back in my chair. "Because, Michael, you stopped listening a long time ago." There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, the muffled sound of Rachel's footsteps in the background. She told me things," he said weakly. "I know she did," I replied evenly. "And you believed her because it was easier than facing the truth." "I didn't want this to happen," he murmured. "Neither did I said. "But here we are." He didn't argue. He didn't defend her. He just sat in the silence of someone finally realizing which bridge they'd let burn. The holidays in Springfield have a way of magnifying everything. Lights on porches, wreaths on doors, families packed into church pews. This year, the whispers about Rachel and the court case became part of that seasonal fabric. Not cruel gossip, but something quieter: awareness. At the Christmas Eve service, I sat near the back with the Harrisons. Rachel and Michael arrived late. She scanned the room instinctively like she always did, gauging the temperature. She caught eyes, got polite nods, but not the warm smiles she was used to. Springfield doesn't ostracize quickly, but it notices and it remembers. During the closing hymn, I glanced across the pews. Eli waved at me shyly. June gave a tiny smile. Rachel looked straight ahead, jaw tight, pretending not to notice. Michael looked down. When the service ended, I stepped out into the cold night. Snow had begun to fall, thin, hesitant flakes swirling under the streetlights. The church bells rang clear and slow. People were talking in small clusters, warm breath fogging the air. I caught fragments of conversation. "My name, Rachel's name, court," recording judge said. "Nothing malicious. Just Springfield doing what Springfield does, piecing the truth together collectively." The cracks in Rachel's story weren't explosive. They were methodical, spreading like ice fissures across a pond. She'd spent years building a facade strong enough to fool people who weren't looking closely. But once the surface broke, everything underneath became visible. Rachel's reputation had thrived in the shadows of polite doubt. Now it stood under the clear winter sky, and people were finally looking. December 19th, 2022 was a Monday. A gray, quiet day in Springfield. The kind of day where the streets look washed out, like someone turned the saturation down on the world. I stood on the courthouse steps again. Same leather portfolio in hand, same navy coat buttoned up tight. But this time I wasn't walking into a fight. I was walking in to close one. The mediated visitation consent order was scheduled for final review and entry. No dramatics, no cross-examinations, just signatures, confirmations, and the quiet weight of resolution. Leonard met me at the base of the stairs, his breath fogging in the cold. "Today," he said simply, "we formalize what was already decided." Inside, courtroom 3B was half empty. Rachel and Michael sat together at the respondent's table. She was dressed impeccably again, but the poise had dulled. She avoided eye contact, flipping through papers she'd already memorized. Michael looked tired, truly tired this time. Not defensive, not resentful, just spent. The judge entered at 9:03 a.m. sharp. She glanced over the file briefly, her glasses low on her nose. "This matter," she began, "concerns the mediated visitation agreement between Mr. Miller and Miss Miller. The court has reviewed the proposed consent order and finds it acceptable. Do both parties agree to the terms?" Leonard stood. "Yes, Your Honor." Callahan, Rachel Sepp's attorney, rose reluctantly. "We do, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Then this order is entered effective immediately. Mr. Miller Sepp's visitation rights are legally formalized under the agreed schedule. Any future disputes must follow mediation procedures before additional petitions can be filed." Her gavel struck once, clean, decisive. It wasn't theatrical like the December 5th hearing. There were no gasps, no audio recordings echoing through the room, but it carried a different kind of power. This was permanence, paper, ink, law. Rachel exhaled sharply through her nose, the only crack in her mask. Michael stared down at his hands. The consent order had been mediated over 2 long sessions the previous week. Sessions where Rachel had tried to claw back control through language, but Leonard had matched her maneuver for maneuver. In the end, the schedule was clear. Alternating weekends, specific holidays, summer visitation periods. No vague case-by-case wording. No wiggle room for reinterpretation. I watched the judge sign the document. 3 years of careful documentation, quiet endurance, and strategic patience condensed into a single moment of ink drying on paper. Legacy secured not by emotion but by evidence. After court, Leonard and I stepped out into the cold again. "You did it," he said simply. "No," I replied. "We did it." He gave a small grin. "You start the rare client who listens better than he talks." We shook hands on the courthouse steps. Not dramatic, just steady, like everything we'd built. I went home and laid the consent order on my kitchen table. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock, a sound that had become a kind of metronome for these past 3 years. I opened my ledger and wrote the final entry for that chapter. December 19th, 2022, mediated visitation consent order entered. Legal visitation formalized. Case closed. Then I closed the ledger slowly, pressing my hand against the worn cover. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the edge of a new battle waiting, just a clean horizon. That evening, I received an email from Mrs. Collins. The subject line was simple: "Congratulations." She sat attached a short note. "I've seen a lot of families struggle, Mr. Miller. Very few have the courage to do it the right way. Eli and June are lucky to have you." I read it twice before replying. Her words carried more weight than she probably knew. Teachers see everything. They're the quiet archivists of community truths. Michael called later that night. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "I heard it, that's official," he said. "It is," I replied. He didn't apologize. Not outright. But he didn't need to, not that night. "The kids are excited," he added softly. I closed my eyes for a moment. Good. That sip's what matters now. There was silence, then a quiet, almost broken laugh from him. "You never stopped, did you?" "No," I said. "I couldn't set," he exhaled. "Maybe that sep's what I should have done." I didn't answer that. Some realizations don't need replies, they just need to settle. Outside, the snow began to fall again, light and steady. The street lights caught the flakes, turning the air into slow-moving glitter. For 3 years, Rachel had tried to reshape my role through whispers, legal letters, and manipulation. But truth has a way of holding its ground when you give it structure. The house felt different that night. Not fuller, just steadier. The kind of steadiness you earned, not inherit. Spring in Springfield arrives late, like a guest who takes their time knocking. By April 2023, the snow had finally melted from the edges of the sidewalks, revealing muddy grass and stubborn daffodils pushing through. The cold months had been long, but they'd also been clarifying. For the first time in 3 years, my house didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a home again. The first Sunday of April, Michael pulled into my driveway just before noon. His old silver Honda looked the same as it always had, but something about the way he parked carefully, deliberately, felt different. Eli and June spilled out of the back seat before he even turned off the ignition. "Grandpa!" they shouted in overlapping bursts, racing toward the porch. The sound hit me like warm light breaking through stained glass. I crouched down as they threw themselves into my arms. Eli's jacket still smelled faintly of chalk dust. June's braid was slightly lopsided, like Rachel hadn't had the patience that morning. Their laughter filled the entryway as they kicked off their shoes, the same way Michael used to when he was their age. Michael walked up the steps slowly, hands in his jacket pockets. He looked older, not in years, but in the way people do when they've finally stopped running from their own reflection. "Morning, Dad," he said. "Morning," I replied evenly. We stood there for a moment. No courtroom, no lawyers, no unspoken intermediaries, just father and son on a quiet Sunday morning in spring. Inside, the house carried faint traces of Helen's touch: the curtain she'd chosen, the ceramic bird on the kitchen shelf, the small scuff on the baseboard near the pantry where Michael had crashed his tricycle decades earlier. The kids noticed everything. Eli pointed at the framed class photo from his school where I'd helped build the library corner. June tugged at my hand, asking if she could water the plants with the funny watering can. Helen's old copper one shaped like a duck. Yes, I said. Of course. They ran off, their voices trailing through the house like music I hadn't realized I'd missed this much. Michael lingered near the dining table. His eyes landed on the ledger, now closed and tucked neatly on the bookshelf. He gave a small, almost rueful smile. I used to think this place was stuck in time, he said. Now it just feels solid. It always was, I replied. You just weren't set looking. He nodded, not defensively this time, but with quiet acceptance. That was new. We ate lunch together, grilled cheese sandwiches, tomato soup, and a lemon pie Mrs. Harrison had dropped off that morning. It wasn't a holiday, but it felt like one in its simplicity. The kids told me about their new teacher, their spring play auditions, Eli's science fair volcano disaster. June proudly showed me a drawing she'd made of Grandpa's house, complete with the crooked mailbox and Helen's rose bushes beginning to bloom again. She'd drawn herself and Eli holding my hands in front of it. For a moment, I had to look away so they wouldn't see the sting in my eyes. After lunch, the kids played in the backyard while Michael and I sat on the porch with coffee. The air was warm enough to keep the jackets off, and the faint sound of a lawnmower hummed from a few houses down. I should have stood up sooner, Michael said finally. I didn't answer right away. He stared into his mug. I let her control the narrative, and I let it be easy. You never did. Michael, I said quietly, easy and right are rarely the same thing. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I see that now. It wasn't an apology in words, but it was in everything else, and that was enough, for now. As the afternoon faded, they packed up to leave. Eli hugged me twice. June made me promise I'd come to her play in May. I told her I wouldn't miss it for the world. Michael lingered on the porch again, looking at the house the way people do when they realize history doesn't disappear. It just waits. When they drove away, I stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet. Then I went back inside and looked at the small, empty spare key hook by the door. For years, that empty hook had felt like a wound. Now it felt like a boundary, clear, deliberate, earned. I didn't rehang a key. I left it empty on purpose. Some doors don't need to be unlocked again. They just need to stand strong. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat by the window as the late afternoon light stretched across the living room floor. The house was quiet, but not hollow. For the first time since 2019, the quiet wasn't something I had to survive. It was something I'd built back, piece by piece, with patience, evidence, and love. Rachel had tried to erase my place in this family. She'd underestimated something simple. Truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs time and structure to stand. You didn't lose me, I whispered to the empty room. You gave me away, and I found my way home. Springfield, April 2024. The town was waking up again. Tulips lined the sidewalks, robins darted between budding trees, and the morning air carried that cool, clean scent you only get for a few weeks before summer heat takes over. A year had passed since the courtroom, since the consent order, since I stood in this very house wondering if legacy could be reclaimed after betrayal. I had my answer now. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cinematic, it was steady. On a Thursday afternoon, I sat on the porch with a book in one hand, and Helen's old gardening gloves folded neatly beside me. The roses along the fence were just starting to bud. I'd pruned them back carefully in March, the same way Helen used to firm cuts that made way for new growth. Legacy is like that. You don't preserve it by freezing it in time. You tend it, prune what doesn't serve, and give it space to bloom again. Michael's car pulled up just after 4. Eli and June spilled out, backpacks bouncing, voices bright. Grandpa, June called, waving a stack of papers. We got our play parts. She bounded up the walkway, nearly tripping on the last step, her excitement spilling everywhere. Eli followed, rolling his eyes affectionately like a 10-year-old who thinks he's 17. Michael trailed behind them, carrying a bag of groceries. He came more often now, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. Inside, the house filled with movement. June spread her script out on the dining table, practicing lines in an exaggerated stage whisper. Eli headed for the backyard to check on the birdhouse we'd built last summer. Michael unpacked the groceries slowly, then handed me a small jar. Your favorite marmalade, he said. Mrs. Harrison made a new batch. I smiled. She never misses a season. He leaned against the counter. You've done a lot with the garden, he said, glancing out the window. Your mother started it, I replied. I just keep it honest. He nodded, quiet for a moment. Over the past year, our conversations had shifted. No more skirting around truths, no more hidden tension, just steady rebuilding. Some days were easy, some weren't, but they were real. Later that evening, we walked to Springfield Elementary together for the Spring Arts Showcase. The hallways smelled faintly of tempera paint and pencil shavings, unchanged since the days I was principal. Parents filled the gym, chatting in clusters, kids darting between display boards. As we entered, a few teachers waved. Not polite waves, familiar ones. Mrs. Collins spotted me near the reading booth. Mr. Miller, she called, you have to see June Chid's poster. It says adorable. June's artwork hung near the entrance, a drawing of a big house with blooming roses, a crooked mailbox, and three figures holding hands in front of it. She'd labeled it in bright pink marker, My Family's Spring. I stood there for a moment, letting that sink in. A year ago, my place in their lives had been something Rachel tried to erase with complaints and legal filings. Now it was immortalized in crayon and construction paper, hanging on the wall for the entire school to see. Rachel wasn't there that night. She still lived in town, still picked up the kids after school, still maintained her curated image. But something fundamental had shifted. After the court ruling, she kept her distance from public narratives about me. She didn't try to control the PTA Whisper network anymore. She couldn't. The story was written, not by rumor, but by evidence and time. Michael caught my eye across the gym during June's short performance. His expression wasn't regretful anymore. It was something closer to peace. Slowly, he was finding his way back, not to the past, but to a future where truth wasn't something he avoided. After the showcase, we walked home together under the soft glow of streetlights. The kids skipped ahead, racing each other to the mailbox. Michael walked beside me in silence for a while, then said quietly, You know, I used to think legacy was something you inherit. I didn't realize it's something you build and protect. I smiled faintly. You stare learning. He laughed softly. Yeah, finally. When we reached the house, the porch light clicked on automatically, illuminating the empty spare key hook by the door. It had remained untouched since that day in 2019 when I noticed the key missing. I'd left it that way deliberately, not out of bitterness, but as a quiet reminder. Boundaries can protect as much as they separate. Michael noticed it too. You never replaced it, he said. No, I replied. Some things are better left exactly as they are. It sets how we remember what changed. Ely and June ran inside ahead of us, their laughter spilling into the hallway like sunlight. Michael lingered on the porch for a moment. He looked at me not as the father he'd avoided, or the man caught in his wife's narrative, but simply as his father. Thanks, Dad, he said softly, for not giving up. I met his eyes. Thank you for finally standing still long enough to look. He nodded, then followed his kids inside. I stood there a moment longer, the night air cool against my face. The roses would bloom fully in a few weeks. The house was steady. The family, fractured but mending, was finding its rhythm again. Rachel's shadow no longer dictated the story. Truth did. Quiet, patient, persistent truth. Legacy isn't inherited. It's built. Brick by brick, act by act, season by season. And if you guard it with patience and structure, it stands.